Graveyard shift workers. What crazy, creepy, unbelievable things have you seen working in the dead of night? I worked the night shift at a campground, from midnight to 8 every morning. It wasn't a bad gig. I'd bring my PlayStation 2 and spend most of the night gaming, since I usually only had to deal with 1 or 2 people, even on busy nights. It was just me, sitting alone in a little 8x8-foot shack, surrounded by darkness. My first week there, the other third shift guy, the one who was quitting, told me about a payphone a few feet from the shack. He said it rang every night at 4:17 in the morning. Just once. He figured it was probably some kind of automated test call. He'd never answered it himself. I worked there for a few months without thinking much of it. It was the middle of summer, and most nights I kept the windows closed, so I couldn't even hear the payphone when it went off. By mid-August, I started leaving the windows open at night. Sure enough, at 4:17 every morning, the phone would ring once. The sound was strange, muted, almost hollow, like the payphone had been submerged underwater and then left out to dry. One night, I finally worked up the nerve to answer it. I set an alarm for 4:15 and waited by the phone. When it rang, I picked it up. Nothing, just dead air, like someone was there but wouldn't speak. I said hello a few times, then hung up. I did the same thing every night for a week. Each time, the same result. 1 ring, silence. Eventually, I stopped bothering and left it alone for about a month. Then, during the first week of October, I decided to try again. I set my alarm, waited, and when the time came, I lifted the receiver. Hello, hello? Then I heard it. What sounded like someone inhaling through clenched teeth. The voice that followed was rough, like the person had gargled gravel. The best comparison I can give is Horace P. Gage from The Suffering. He said my name, my full name, first, middle, and last. It was a voice I'd never heard before. My throat tightened, and I hung up immediately. Hands shaking, I fumbled some change into the payphone and dialed 69. The call had come from California. I live in Indiana. Story 2. It was late at night, around 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was stuck working the midnight shift at an old shop near my house. It wasn't a bad place, close to home, and as a kid, I used to go there whenever I'd saved up enough money to buy a treat. I miss those days when life felt simple and sleep came easily, when I didn't have to work long hours or take the graveyard shift. Lately, though, it's been harder to shake off what my grandmother once told me about an ancient beast that hunts those who stay up too late. She used to tell that story to scare me into going to bed. Now, it only makes the hours here feel heavier. I went out to take the trash when I noticed something moving in the garbage bin. When it suddenly popped out, I nearly bolted, but it was just a raccoon. Still, something felt off. It startled me more than it should have. The way it moved wasn't right. Its motions were stiff, jerky, almost as if it were being controlled by invisible strings. I shook it off, finished up, and headed back inside. The shop was nearly empty, just me and the constant hum of the fluorescent lights. Everything seemed like it was going to be another long, quiet night, until I heard a faint tapping on the window. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, sharper, more insistent. Finally, I turned to look. A man stood outside, wearing a hockey mask and a butcher's outfit. The moment I saw him, I shouted, "Get out before I call the cops!" I knew I shouldn't have yelled, but instinct took over. It was pure fight or flight. Without hesitation, I chose flight and hid in the back. I called 911 and they told me to stay put. But before I could even process what was happening, I heard the sharp sound of glass shattering, followed by a maniacal laugh. At that moment, I realized he wanted me dead. I scrambled to my feet, searching for an exit, but the door was locked from the outside. I turned to hide, only to see him standing behind the counter. Just looking at him sent chills down my spine. He began walking toward me, slow, deliberate steps that made my heart race. There wasn't much I could do. I bolted toward the storage room. It had a lock on the inside and a few places to hide for emergencies like this. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and crouched behind some shelves, praying he hadn't seen me. For a moment, all I could hear were his heavy footsteps echoing through the shop. He tried the door, rattling the handle, but it held firm. Then there was silence. He walked away. I let out a shaky breath of relief, until about 5 seconds later, I heard him return. This time, he had a chair. A split second later, the crash of splintering wood filled the air as he smashed the door down. For 5 painfully long minutes, he searched for me until I heard the police sirens in the distance. Then he started to walk away. I came out of the room, only to be grabbed by the throat. Luckily, the police arrived just in time and managed to get him off me before he could do much damage. Only now am I finding out that he was the one behind several disappearances in town. Even though I saw him being put in the car and taken away, every time I work the graveyard shift again, I feel like he's watching me from afar. Story 3. One night, I packed up what was left of my life into a U-Haul and headed south. At 27, I'd burned out on city life and decided a change of pace and scenery was exactly what I needed. I landed a night shift job at Manchac Port, just outside New Orleans. The port sat on the very edge of the Manchac Swamp, a place I'd only ever heard spoken about in hushed tones. I found a small, single-story house a few miles from the port. It was cheap, perched on blocks against the inevitable floods, and backed right up to the dark wall of cypress and moss that marked the swamp's edge. When I first moved in, the air was so thick and humid it felt like breathing soup. At night, the silence was profound, broken only by the steady drone of insects and the occasional croak of a giant bullfrog. The job was simple enough: stacking crates, logging inventory, and babysitting a few $1 million worth of cargo. It was monotonous and lonely until I met Larry. Larry was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, lean, quiet, and always carrying the faint smell of tobacco and swamp water. He was the only other person crazy enough to take the 11 to 7 shift with me in my section. Despite his gruff exterior, he was friendly enough. A few weeks in, during one of our breaks, we were sitting on a couple of overturned oil drums when I made a joke about the place's spooky atmosphere. Larry didn't laugh. "You won't be laughing long, Mikey," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You're working on the edge of the Manchac now. That swamp. It ain't just water and trees." Larry gave me the first real warning. He talked about the swamp folk, a mix of shadow people, restless spirits, and vengeful voodoo priests whose rituals and sacrifices had cursed the land for generations. He told me about the bad things that had happened deep in the muck: rituals for power, offerings to dark spirits, and violence that lingered long after the blood was gone. Whenever he spoke about it, he kept his eyes on the ground, like saying the words out loud might call something listening in the dark. Not long after that conversation, the strange things began. One warm, pitch-black night, I was sitting in my backyard trying to unwind after work when I heard it. A low, clear whistle drifting from the edge of the swamp. It wasn't the wind. It sounded almost human, but too melodic, too inviting. The hair on my arms stood on end. Another night, I heard children laughing, a chorus of tiny, joyful voices that felt horribly out of place. Manchac is no place for kids, and the sound seemed to circle me just beyond sight, fading into the moss and mud. Sometimes it was weeping instead, a faint, broken sob, like a woman crying into her hands. always coming from somewhere deep among the trees. The lights were the worst. Strange orbs, sometimes blue, sometimes a sickly green, would drift just above the swamp water like ghostly lanterns. They weren't fireflies, and they didn't move like anything natural. They just hovered there, watching. At work, the port started to feel like a stage for an unseen audience. I'd be alone in the inventory section when I'd hear voices, muffled, indistinct, sometimes whispering my name, other times muttering in a strange guttural language I couldn't place. Then came the footsteps, heavy boots on concrete, stopping, just behind me. I'd spin around, flashlight slicing through the dark, but there was never anyone there. That's when I started seeing him, the Hat Man. Just flickers at first. A shape in my peripheral vision, a shadow taller and darker than any man, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned brimmed hat. He wasn't solid, more like a void that moved, and every time I turned to face him, he was gone. I told Larry about it, everything, the whistles, the laughter, the Hat Man. He just grunted, stared out toward the swamp, and muttered, "Didn't I tell you, Mikey? Leave well enough alone." He never wanted to talk about it again, and that silence, his refusal, was more unnerving than anything I'd seen. The tension kept building, like a wire tightening in my chest. One night, a blood-curdling scream tore through the swamp, a sound of pure terror and pain. And then suddenly, it stopped, cut off, clean. I didn't sleep for 2 days. Then came the night that changed everything. Around 1 a.m, I was standing on my back porch. The air was thick, unmoving. And then I heard it again. The whistle. That same haunting, melodic tune, but closer this time, almost on my property line. My curiosity, stronger than my fear, began to pull me forward. I took a step toward the tall grass. Then my phone rang, an unknown number. I answered, breath unsteady. A woman's voice, rough, urgent, cut through the static. "Don't look! Don't look!" she hissed. "You hear that whistling? Ignore it. If you hear it again, bolt the door and stuff your ears. He'll take your curiosity as an invitation. Now hang up, hang up." The line went dead. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. The whistling stopped instantly, replaced by a low, humming silence that somehow felt worse. The next day, I went to the only nearby house to ask if they knew anything. An older couple answered, confused. They told me they'd been out of town for a week, visiting family. After that, the house itself turned against me. I'd catch shadows gliding across the walls in my periphery, always just out of reach. It was him, the Hat Man. I knew it. Then things started moving, disappearing, reappearing days later in places that made no sense. My car keys under a neatly folded pile of laundry, my wallet sitting in the microwave. I kept telling myself it was exhaustion, that the long nights were wearing me down. But I was tired, always tired. Then came the night that broke me. I was working in the old storage section of the port, a vast echoing space where the lights always flickered and the air never seemed to warm. I was logging a new shipment of machinery, completely alone, when that feeling hit me again. That prickling, feverish certainty that someone was watching. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him, Larry. He was peeking at me from behind a towering stack of wooden crates, just half his face visible, eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on me with an eerie, empty stare. My stomach dropped. A cold wave of dread swept through me. Something about him was wrong. His skin looked pale, drawn tight like paper, and he didn't move. I stood frozen as his head slowly, deliberately, slipped back behind the crates. "Oh, what's up, Larry? Thought you went home already," I called out, my voice trembling. I circled around the crates, flashlight jerking through the shadows in frantic arcs. He was gone. The walkway stretched out long and straight. There was no other way out. Then, at the far end, I saw him, the Hat Man. That tall, dark figure, the brim of his hat cutting a sharp silhouette against the flickering light. He was moving quickly, gliding almost, before disappearing behind the last stack of crates. I stumbled back, gasping for air, my chest tightening as panic clawed its way up my throat. Then I bolted, ran toward the nearest group of workers, words tumbling out between ragged breaths. "I just saw Larry. He was behind the crates. Did you see him go out?" They froze. Tools stopped clattering. Every face turned toward me with the same uneasy expression. Dan, a big guy from shipping, finally spoke, his voice low and uncertain. "Mikey, I don't know what you're talking about." He hesitated, swallowing hard. "Larry's been dead for a couple of months now." My blood turned to ice. "He died in an accident right here on the job," another guy said, his voice low. "Under mysterious circumstances." He wouldn't meet my eyes. Dan stepped forward, pity softening his face. "The job posting you answered. You were hired to replace Larry." A few days later, I turned in my 2-week notice. I didn't last that long. I packed my bags, left the keys on the counter of that little house, and drove away before the sun came up. I told my boss I couldn't handle the night shifts anymore, that the exhaustion was eating me alive. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was, I knew the Hat Man had seen me. I knew the ghost of the man I'd called my friend was just a terrified soul, and that the Hat Man was something worse, something that used the dead to lure the living. And I knew the whistle had been for me, because when I stepped toward that door, when I let curiosity outweigh fear, I gave him my invitation. Story 4. I work in a shipping and receiving facility that was originally built as a military base and munitions factory during World War II. One night, my partner and I were the only ones there, just the two of us in the entire complex. He had a habit of sneaking off to nap under the guise of doing rounds. I didn't really mind. There were only 2 of us. And if I ever needed him, I could radio and he'd come back. So, one night, off he went to check the perimeter, which of course meant sleep. I should probably describe our office a bit. The main doors and entryway lead to a set of magnetically locked inner doors, and between those 2 sets of doors sits our office. It's surrounded by windows on all 4 sides, so we can see everything. The employee parking lot on one side and the main corridor of the facility on the other. On these shifts, we'd sometimes watch TV on the computers to pass the time, and that's exactly what I was doing while my partner was off, doing rounds. I was sitting there, minding my own business, when I turned around to watch the show playing on the computer behind me. Then, out of habit, I turned back toward the corridor, and that's when I saw it. It looked like someone standing just outside the window. I could only see the edge of a jacket, specifically the shoulder seam and what looked like a patch. I jumped, thinking it was my partner, but he never came through the doors. After a minute or so, I convinced myself I was just tired and went back to my show. But a few minutes later, I turned around again, and there it was. The same jacket, the same patch, right in front of the window. I sat staring as the patch seemed to fade away into the reflection. My partner didn't come back for another 30 minutes. We also have what we call ghost traffic. There are cameras all over the facility, inside, outside, along the perimeter, so we can always see and usually hear if a semi-truck is entering or leaving. But every now and then, we'll hear a truck drive right past our office, engine rumbling, air brakes hissing. And yet nothing shows up on the cameras. No headlights, no movement at the gate, no truck ever pulls up to the guard shack. It's as if something heavy rolls by, unseen. Story 5, I've got a few. I work as a transporter in a hospital. About 2 years ago, we moved from the old city hospital into a new, state-of-the-art facility. The old building had been constructed in the 1930s, and it was definitely showing its age. At night, it could be downright creepy. Each floor had an east and a west wing. The east wing of the fourth floor was the first to be shut down, about 2 weeks before the move. One night, around 9:30, I was on the floor to pick up a patient from the west wing. I noticed a small group of nurses and aides gathered together. They all used to work on the now closed east wing. They looked visibly shaken, so I walked over to ask if everything was okay. They told me they had decided to walk through their old wing for nostalgia's sake. While they were there, the phone at the nurses' station suddenly started ringing. The thing was, the computers and phones hadn't even been moved yet. Not knowing what else to do, one of the nurses reached over the counter and answered the phone. She said there was a woman's voice on the other end, sounding confused. This is the conversation as best I can remember it. Nurse: "This is Name. How can I help you?" Voice: "Hello. Who is this?" Nurse: "This is Name. I'm a nurse. Is there anything I can help you with?" Voice: "Where am I?" Nurse: "This is hospital Name. Are you a patient here?" Voice: "Oh, okay." Then the line went dead. That's when the nurse finally looked at the phone's screen to see where the call had come from. The phone display showed the room number directly next to the nurse's station. By that point, every room had been cleared out, and the phones had already been removed. They could see straight into the room, and it was completely empty. That's when they bolted for the west wing, where I happened to be stepping off the elevator. I avoided that wing for the rest of my time there. My mother started working at the hospital right out of college. It was the only job she ever knew. On moving day, she was determined to walk through every hallway one last time before leaving. She brought her camera and took pictures as she went. On one of the empty patient wings, she stopped to take a photo. Just as she raised her camera, the door to the room beside her slammed shut, hard, as if someone on the other side had thrown it with all their strength. That was enough for her. My mom decided she was done taking pictures. This happened to me just last Friday. It was going on 10 o'clock, and I was taking my last patient back to her room. She was a sweet, elderly lady, stable enough to ride in a wheelchair, but definitely needing help when on her feet. I got her settled into bed, made sure she was comfortable, and set the bed alarm before turning out the lights and stepping out. I pulled the curtain behind me, not all the way, just enough to keep the hallway light from flooding in, while still letting me see her in bed. Her nurse was in the room next door, and I waited in the hall for her to come out. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I distinctly saw someone walk past the curtain inside the old woman's room. The figure was about her height and had the same gray hair. My first thought was, she shouldn't be up walking around. Then I remembered the bed alarm was set. The room was silent. When I looked in, she was still lying exactly where I'd left her, sound asleep. The bed alarm hadn't made a sound. That's when I got the most intense, full-body chills of my life. The nurse stepped out of the other room. I passed along my message, and then I got out of there as fast as I could. Story 6. Up until a few months ago, I spent almost 2 years working swing shift as a security guard at the university I attended. It was a great job with solid benefits, but the hours were brutal. Mondays, 7 to 3. Tuesdays and Wednesdays, 3 to 11. Thursdays and Fridays, 11 at night to 7 in the morning. The university itself is beautiful. Old buildings, tree-lined walkways, and a calm sense of history. But it sits in a rough neighborhood. A red light district, a few housing projects, and some run-down nursing homes surround it. I saw my fair share of weird and creepy stuff. Half-clothed old men, crackheads, and homeless folks wandering around in the middle of the night, the occasional gunshot not far from where I was patrolling. That sort of thing. Nothing ever really crossed into the creepy or paranormal range for me, though some of my coworkers swear they've seen wild things. So instead, I'll tell my favorite funny story. One morning, around 2 o'clock, maybe my third week on the job, I was walking from my apartment after a quick snack break back to the office, which wasn't far. Normally, at that hour, I'd be in the truck doing rounds. Not being in it was mistake number one. We weren't classified as armed security, meaning no firearms, but we did carry extendable batons. In my state, you need a license to carry and use one. I, being somewhat reckless, had mine anyway, even though I wasn't licensed yet. My logic was simple. I'd rather risk an assault charge than go unarmed and end up stabbed. Careless? Absolutely. But at the time, it made perfect sense to me. As I was walking back, I saw what was obviously a drunk man stumbling toward me. Shaking down the jitters, this was my first real encounter. I went over to talk to him and escort him off campus, which is usually no big deal. 90% of the time, drunk people just want to get home and aren't looking for trouble. This guy, apparently, was. He immediately got belligerent and started screaming at me. I kept my distance, but he began advancing, fists raised. On instinct, I grabbed my baton and extended it. Luckily for me, hitting him could have gotten me fired, if not arrested. I realized I shouldn't swing. For some reason I still can't explain, I pointed the baton at him and yelled at the top of my lungs, "Expelliarmus!" The belligerent drunk man stopped in his tracks, turned around, and walked right off campus. I never saw him again. TLDR, night security, successfully disarmed a belligerent drunk man. Still waiting on my Hogwarts letter. Story 7. I eat my lunch in silence, watching the flickering fluorescent light at the end of the room as it casts the vending machine's shadows, crawling up and down the wall. An empty office space like this takes on a peculiar, almost eerie atmosphere at night. Night security guards will probably understand what I mean. It's as if it's not just the building that's empty, but the world itself. In those moments, it feels like you've been dropped into a void, stripped of its original purpose, suspended in stillness. The space seems to exist only to convince you, the lone observer, that this isn't some alternate dimension of loneliness, but simply an office waiting for the next shift to arrive. Time twists into strange forms. The next shift is due to begin in only a few hours, yet it feels as if it may never come, as though this place will remain perpetually empty, meaningless, bathed in its flickering light and heavy silence. Having a snack does little to help. If anything, it only deepens the hollow feeling inside me. I send my girlfriend a text, a feeble attempt at human contact, and instantly regret it. The contractor was here only a few hours ago, and before that, I'd spent the entire day out and about, surrounded by people. Yet now, it feels as though none of that ever happened, or that it all took place in some distant, unreachable past, leaving me stranded in this strange limbo of a waiting building. Back to the nicotine room, back to the task at hand. It's around 3:30 in the morning. I've moved to another side of the room where the shadows are deeper, the single bulb failing to reach the corners. I plug in a lamp and angle it toward one particularly dark spot. Then, movement. A flicker in the corner of my eye, somewhere above. I glance up and freeze. Someone is standing outside the skylight, white legs, boots. But the legs fade into nothing, disembodied, floating. Heart pounding, I step back, staring as the figure retreats. It takes several long seconds before I realize what I'm seeing is only my own reflection in the glass, illuminated by the lamp. I feel utterly foolish, but my nerves are frayed. I can't believe how many more hours I still have to endure in this room, surrounded by the lingering stench of bleach and nicotine, feeling it seep into my pores. I just want to go home. So I do. I say, screw it. and head for the lift. I descend through the empty building to the lit but vacant foyer, then step out into the cold night. Distant sirens wail, stars glimmer overhead, and lights glow in faraway windows. A fragile sense of normality returns. I'm still spooked, but the fresh air brings a small, welcome relief. I open the security gates to the car park and slide into my car. The engine turns over but refuses to start. It's an old car, prone to problems, so I'm not surprised, but my heart still sinks. I try again. The starter groans, the battery weakening. I know I should stop, yet I keep turning the key until the power fades completely, leaving only a hollow, futile click. The next bus won't run until around 7, and I can't afford a taxi. I don't have breakdown cover, and anyone who might help is asleep, tucked safely in bed. I'm not about to wake someone over a spooky room problem. With a frustrated sigh, I turn back toward the building, deciding to wait for the first bus when morning service resumes. By the time I return to the refectory, I'm scolding myself for being so foolish. What's there to be afraid of, really? It's just a council office building, just the smoking room. Nighttime plays tricks on the mind, warping perception, making ordinary things seem strange. I remind myself of this as I turn the corner from the refectory into the corridor, then around the next bend. That's when I see movement. The door to the old toilets, a heavy fire door with a sprung cantilever above the frame, is slowly closing, halfway shut. I freeze. There's only one possibility. Someone else is in the building. But why would they go into the old toilets? As far as I know, they're out of order. I briefly consider the unlikely idea of an early council worker coming in to splash water on their face. But then I remember. There's no running water in there. I know full well I'm stepping into a real-life horror setup, and logically, the last thing I should do is open that door and investigate. Naturally, it's the first thing I do. The toilets are grim, modern, yet abandoned. The light doesn't work, so I have to rely on the dull fluorescent glow bleeding in from the corridor. There are cubicles ahead, their doors slightly ajar, and I can't imagine anyone willingly coming in here, especially in this darkness. "Hello!" I call out, trying to sound casual, as if this is all perfectly routine. I wedge the door open with a screwdriver and step inside to check the cubicles. I already know they're empty, yet I look anyway. And of course they are. No one is there. Back in the smoking room, it's equally deserted. If whoever it was had gone back toward the refectory, I would have seen them in the corridor. The place is, and can only be, completely abandoned. Satisfied, I pack my things and leave the building, relieved just to escape. I end up walking 10 miles home through the cold, quiet dark. The next day, I call the contractor and explain that the job isn't for me. The nights are too long, too unpleasant, and I'm not cut out for them. It's no great loss, it's decent pay, and plenty of other subcontractors will jump at it. Later that afternoon, my dad helps me retrieve the car. In the end, I spent a night painting a smoking room in a creepy, deserted office block, scared myself half to death, then had to walk 10 miles home and learned once and for all that night shifts aren't for me. Story 8. I work in a hospital, so I've got plenty of stories to tell. I'm an administrative agent, which means I've seen and heard just about everything. I'll start with the most disgusting incidents first, then move on to the general creepiness that comes with night shifts. Because let's be honest, night shifts are a whole different world. I once saw part of a rotted shoulder assembly, a shoulder blade attached to a couple of bones, a joint somewhere in there, held together by a few decaying ligaments, lying in the parking lot. It looked big enough to belong to a child or something, so I called security. They sent a nurse from the ER to check it out before involving the police, and it turned out to be from a dog or a pig, or some other small mammal. Weird, but thankfully not human. This happened not long after the Magnata incident, so everyone was on edge about the possibility of finding more human body parts scattered around. To make it even creepier, the man Magnota killed had attended the same university I did, which made the whole thing hit a little too close to home. Keep in mind, during the night shift, most hospitals shut off their main lights to conserve electricity, leaving only the emergency lighting. That alone is enough to make the place feel unsettling. The hallways turn into ghostly tunnels, and the shadows seem to move on their own, making your mind play tricks on you. A friend's father, who worked as a housekeeper, once had to clean one of the upper floors in a hospital building. After finishing, he turned off the lights and took the elevator down to catch his bus home in the middle of the night. As he crossed the street toward the bus stop, he glanced up and saw that all the lights on the floor he'd just cleaned were back on. Thinking he'd forgotten or that another staff member was still around, he went back up to turn them off. But when he returned to the bus stop, the lights were on again. That's when he decided, nope, not going back up there. Something's going to eat me. It was late, the building was supposed to be empty, and no one else was around. Maybe someone was playing a prank, but that eerie glow in the windows, cutting through the dark and empty night, was enough to make anyone's skin crawl. 2. A friend of mine, also a housekeeper, was working the graveyard shift, cleaning a floor in the rehabilitation building. The place was empty, silent, and perfectly designed to make anyone uneasy. He eventually entered an area with several completely soundproof rooms, probably used for auditory rehabilitation. As soon as he stepped into one of them, he felt something strange. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet. Even when he stood perfectly still and tried to breathe softly, he could hear his own heartbeat echoing inside his head, like it was being amplified through hidden speakers. The sensation unnerved him so deeply that he bolted from the room, desperate to get back to the relative comfort of ordinary noise. 3. Psychiatric wards are unsettling even during the day, when they're fully staffed and the inpatients are medicated. At night, though, when the patients are locked in their rooms and only a couple of orderlies remain near the entrance, the atmosphere becomes thick and almost suffocating. My housekeeper friend once had to clean several floors alone. As he hurried through his work, he heard a faint noise behind him and assumed it was one of the orderlies checking in. When he called out, there was no response. The silence and isolation made his skin crawl. A few minutes later, he heard something that froze him in place, a sound like a child laughing. Confused, he searched the area but found no one. Seeking reassurance, he went to the front desk and asked the orderlies if there was any kind of daycare on the floors, above or below. They confirmed there wasn't. He returned to the ward, and the laughter came again, closer this time, from what seemed like a specific corner of the room. He switched on every available light and stood beneath the spot, listening hard. When the laughter echoed once more, he swore it came from the air vent above him. Terrified, he abandoned his cleaning and left immediately, never discovering the source of the sound. As for me, I've had far fewer eerie experiences. During my night shifts, I usually stay tucked away in a secluded office in the basement. No windows, all the lights on, a kind of artificial bubble of safety. Every so often, an ER nurse drops by, or someone from X-ray shows up with a pager issue, offering a fleeting moment of human contact before disappearing back into the night. Still, there are occasional strange cases. I once heard an X-ray technician recount a story about a woman who came into the ER with a hammer lodged head first in her private area. She couldn't remove it herself. The situation was exactly as grotesque as it sounds, and she required immediate medical intervention. Story 9. A couple of weeks ago, I did an AMA about working as a painter and decorator for my city council. This is one of the stories I didn't share there. Before I start, for the American readers, A council is basically a local authority responsible for things like housing, education, and waste disposal. Council tenants are usually low-income residents renting affordable council housing. This story, though, isn't about the tenants. It's about the council itself. One of the council's administration buildings in my city is an old Victorian tower block that's been converted, badly, I should add, into offices. Most of the floors are open plan, divided into departments by those dull gray separator panels, and there's a general air of boredom hanging over the place. The contractor met me at the building and showed me the job, which had to be done at night, after both the day and evening shifts had finished. The reason was simple. The room I was assigned to paint was the smoking room, where council workers slipped away for their cigarette breaks. The room sat on one of the upper floors, tucked away at the end of a narrow corridor near the refectory. The corridor itself sloped upward, as though the architects hadn't quite figured out how to integrate that section into the rest of the modern office layout. It was a peculiar part of the building. The floor tilted slightly and twisted around a couple of corners, past some old toilets, past an arched window narrow enough to resemble an arrow loop. The glass was grimy, the frame webbed with dead flies and dust. The corridor ended at an ancient door, original to the building, its brown paint peeling like decaying skin. Light was scarce there, filtering weakly through the ochre glass of the window, casting the passage in a dim amber haze. The whole stretch felt forgotten, quiet, strange, and unmistakably eerie. I should add that in Britain, smoking rooms are mostly a thing of the past. These days, you have to step outside for your cigarette break, usually into the cold. This story, though, takes place about 10 years ago. Back to the story. The door opened into a small, cramped room with strange, uneven angles, one of those awkward spaces that had been forced into the shape of a modern square. A couple of narrow windows sat high near the ceiling, too high to see out of, and a Velux skylight revealed nothing but the night sky. A threadbare blue carpet had been tossed carelessly across the floor. In some places, it didn't quite reach the walls, and in others, it bunched up where there was too much material around the edges. Along the perimeter sat a mismatched collection of chairs, different styles, heights, and colors. Thrones for the smokers, I suppose. The ceiling was a metal frame filled with polystyrene tiles, some missing, some cracked, others sagging precariously. Everything, and I mean everything, was coated in a layer of grimy yellow nicotine. The chairs, the walls, the ceiling tiles, the door, even the handle, all stained with that same sickly tint. The contractor helped me bring my tools inside, dropped off a bucket, a sponge, and several bottles of cheap bleach, then left me to it. My task was simple enough: scrub away the nicotine stains and repaint the room. So there I was, alone in this little nook at the top of an old Victorian building, in the dead of night. Beneath me stretched floor after floor of empty office space. Not even a security guard in the foyer for company. I did at least have a key code for the front door, in case I needed to step out or come back in. I can't quite describe how eerie that job felt. To refill my bleach bucket, I had to trek down one floor to the toilets, passing through the dimly lit refectory. Going down wasn't too bad, but the return trip was another story. Coming back through that half-lit corridor, past the arched window littered with dead flies, and finally to that peeling, flesh-colored door, was unnerving. Opening it again was worse. The room's nicotine-stained air hit me like a wall. The mismatched circle of chairs seemed to stare into the void beneath the black skylight, while the cracked ceiling tiles sagged above like tired eyes. To break the oppressive atmosphere, I brought a small radio with me. It helped at first, filling the silence with a faint background murmur. But whenever I approached the peeling door to fetch more water, the sound shifted. From the corridor, the low static and half-heard voices made it seem as though someone was in the room, whispering to themselves. Eventually, I had to turn it off. By about 3 in the morning, I was running on fumes. I hadn't planned properly for this job. My intention had been to stay up all night, then crash the following day. But by then, I'd already been awake for nearly 24 hours. The heavy pull of exhaustion settled over me, and I've always blamed what happened next on that fatigue, and my growing urge to just collapse into one of those nicotine-stained chairs. Around 3 o'clock, I decided to break the monotony with some sandwiches. I tossed my bleach-soaked rag into the bucket, the water now a thick, brown sludge of nicotine and grime, grabbed my packed lunch, and headed down to the refectory. Story 10. I've been working night shifts at a small hotel in northern Greece for the past 2 years. It's a quiet place, only 4 floors, mostly older tourists, nothing exciting. I actually like the silence. About a month ago, though, something strange happened. A couple checked in around 11:30 at night, nothing out of the ordinary. They looked tired, barely said a word. The man signed the check-in form, and before I could even offer them room options, he said, "Room 313, please." Here's the thing. There is no room 313. Our 3rd floor has rooms 301 through 312. I've walked those halls hundreds of times. I smiled and told him as politely as I could, "I think you mean 312, maybe." He just smiled back and said, "No, 313 is fine." Before I could respond, he reached into his pocket and handed me a key. Not one of ours, an old metal key with a red tag, the number 313 engraved on it. I froze. The key felt wrong in my hand, cold, like it had been sitting in a freezer. The woman with him still hadn't said a word. She just stared at me the whole time, eyes completely black, not like in a horror movie either. There was nothing there. No light, no reflection. Just 2 empty holes where her eyes should have been. They turned and walked toward the elevator without another word. I tried to stop them, to explain again, but when I followed them upstairs, they were gone. No doors open. No footsteps. No sound. Nothing. I checked the cameras. The elevator went up to the 3rd floor. They stepped out, walked down the hall toward room 312. Then they turned left. But there isn't a left turn there, just a solid wall. In the footage, though, they walked straight into that wall and vanished. I showed the recording to my manager the next morning. He said the cameras must have glitched and claimed the file had already been deleted. I didn't imagine it, and I didn't imagine what I found the next night. The key, sitting on the front desk, same red tag, same number, 313. Since then, I've heard a phone ringing every night around midnight, but only from that side of the 3rd floor. From nothing. I stopped going up there alone. Last night, I picked up the front desk phone just to check the line. There was a voice, a whisper. "Room 313 is ready for you now." Story 11. I used to work for the National Park in Pennsylvania. My job was toll collection, and my shift started at 3 in the morning. My duty was to collect a small fee from commercial vehicles passing through the park at that godforsaken hour. The neat thing was that the first trucks usually didn't come until 5 or 6, except for a few regulars who showed up earlier. Honestly, it was one of the best jobs I've ever had. Great pay for what little you had to do. The only real challenges were, 1, staying awake, and 2, not letting your imagination run wild and scare the hell out of yourself. The booth sat right next to the Delaware River. In the early morning, the fields, the road, and the woods would all be blanketed in mist that clung low to the ground, like ghostly white hedges. Staying awake was tough, but keeping your nerves in check was tougher. I used to pass the time by writing horror stories in that little booth. The setting was too perfect not to. One night, While typing out a few paragraphs, I got this sudden, unmistakable feeling that I was being watched. The mist was thick that night, the kind that drapes itself over everything and turns the world into shifting gray shapes. It was cold too. I think it was November, had to be, since I was home from college at the time. I looked around, bleary-eyed, trying to shake it off, but the feeling clung to me. The booth sat low and square in the middle of the road, heading south on Route 209, with a small parking lot off to the left. The windows gave a wide view, up the parking lot and fee lane, down the road and across the travel lane. I sat there like an idiot, staring out into the white mist, scanning up the road. Nothing. Just the fog swirling under the lone streetlight about a quarter-mile away. After a few moments, I glanced to my left, toward the parking lot and the assessment lane, just to make sure nothing was there. Nothing. I stood up to get a better look, and as I did, a head, complete with horns and flaring nostrils, suddenly popped up right in front of the window, scaring the life out of me. A deer had wandered up to the booth, quietly grazing on the grass growing near the door. I screamed like a little kid when I saw it, and the poor thing bolted off into the mist. I didn't need any more coffee that morning. Story 12. Creepy old buildings are the best. I used to work at an old prison that had been repurposed into an art gallery and studio space. It was originally a workhouse. Low-security prisoners from Washington, D.C., who'd committed minor offenses like theft or public drunkenness were sent there to work on the farm, orchard, and slaughterhouse. In fact, the very first group of inmates built the original brick prison buildings themselves. Over the years, the site expanded. A maximum security complex and a juvenile detention center were added on what had once been open pasture and orchard. As the prison population grew and space ran out, the minimum security section was reclassified as medium security. Eventually, in 1998, the entire complex was shut down and cleared of inmates due to overcrowding, deteriorating buildings, and poor management. I used to sit in my little cubicle in the marketing department and dig through old news clippings about the prison. There were stories about riots, fires, murders, escapes, drugs, and corruption. One day, I came across an article about a killing that had taken place in the very room where I was sitting, and I got the most intense, full-body chills I've ever felt. I don't think I've ever been as uneasy or on edge as I was working in that place. Most of the buildings had been renovated on the inside and looked fairly nice, but not all of them. A few of the old structures, the cell blocks, the theater, the coal-fired power plant, the slaughterhouse, the mess hall, the gym, and a scattering of outbuildings, had simply been abandoned when the last prisoners left. Sometimes I'd go exploring with the facilities guys during the day, and even then, the place was creepy as hell. We did find some fascinating stuff, though. Letters from inmates, old prison uniforms, a couple of shivs, and stacks of yellowed newspaper clippings. Everyone who worked there had their own little story, something strange that happened when they were alone. Even the ones who didn't believe in the paranormal had moments they couldn't explain. The most common sightings were of a woman in 19th century clothing or a man in a dark blue prison jumpsuit. Others reported hearing cats howling, footsteps echoing down empty halls, or the faint rattle of chains in rooms long since locked. The night watch staff never lasted long. They'd talk about hearing cell doors creak open, then slam shut, or muffled screams coming from inside buildings that were completely sealed. And did I mention the place used to have a working slaughterhouse? It sat a few hundred yards away from the main complex, and no one ever went in there. Not even the biggest, toughest guys on staff. Once, while exploring with the facilities crew, we walked past it. All of us felt the same instant, bone-deep chill. And without a word, we decided that was the end of our little tour for the day. But by far, The creepiest part of the entire complex was the steam tunnels. They ran beneath every building, forming a labyrinth of narrow passageways, just a few feet underground, about 5 feet high and 3 feet wide. Originally, they carried pipes filled with steam to heat the prison. When the system was converted to oil or gas heat, sometime in the 1930s, the tunnels were abandoned. Later on, they were reportedly used for smuggling contraband, and even for a few escape attempts. Because of differences in air temperature and pressure between the buildings, there was a constant movement of air through the tunnels, and it howled. I mean, a full-on horror movie-style howl. Visitors to the galleries and artists working in their studios often reported hearing things within that sound. Screams, shouts, banging, and, occasionally, faint strains of music. It unsettled people so much that the management eventually sealed the tunnels with plexiglass doors. But even then, the doors would sometimes fly open or slam shut on their own. I only went into the tunnels once, after a contractor's backhoe accidentally collapsed a section that no one even knew existed. We had an old, hand-drawn schematic of the tunnel network, something we'd found on one of our earlier expeditions to the power plant, but the collapsed section wasn't on it. I entered from the basement of our building while one of the facilities guys went in through the hole the backhoe had dug. We carried two-way radios and copies of the map, trying to figure out where on earth this section connected. It was the middle of a summer day, but down there it was dark, cold, and damp. I've never been much of a believer in the paranormal, but in that kind of setting, your mind starts to play tricks. I kept catching flickers of shadow in my peripheral vision, shapes in the half-light, reflections that looked like eyes glowing in the dark. I had the constant prickling sensation that something was behind me and an overwhelming urge to look over my shoulder. I was probably only down there alone for a minute or two before I found my coworker, but it felt like forever. Story 13. While working night shifts at a fancy hotel in a resort town, I met a guy named Shay. He was a really nice person, but incredibly superstitious and deeply afraid of anything paranormal. It didn't help that Shay was often smoking or snorting something, so his stories could easily be dismissed as hallucinations or overactive imagination. I won't bother retelling all of them, since many could have been made up for any number of reasons. But it's worth noting that he often experienced strange, unexplained encounters. I swear, he was like a magnet for the paranormal. Sometimes an encounter would happen while Shay was working alone in the hotel. He would usually tell us about it shortly afterward, which made for some great story time, and everyone in the late-night department enjoyed his retellings. On rare occasions, though, Shay would call for one of us to come quickly. He would be visibly shaken and didn't want to be alone. None of us ever made fun of him for it. We'd simply head down to whatever part of the hotel he was in and talk with him about what happened. I'd tell him that I believed him, though for my own reasons, rather than his ghostly ones, saying, for example, I could see that happening, but I'd call it a strange coincidence. He was too sane and grounded to dismiss outright. However, after a while, the crazy coincidences began to pile up. Sure, vibrations or poorly stacked items could have eventually knocked over those pans, and cloud formations can create a stray beam of light in the woods outside the window. Maybe those dark, shadowy figures were connected to how Shay was feeling. Still, when strange events happen 2 or 3 times a week, you start to feel a bit resentful. It becomes harder to chalk everything up to coincidence, and instead, I began to suspect that maybe Shay was making things up. But he was such a good guy that none of us wanted to say that outright. So we blamed the drugs, right? He would laugh, and he did, but the strange occurrences never stopped. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, after a late shift, the boys and I were finishing up and getting ready to head out. It was a long walk to the exit through the service tunnels, and since all the guests were gone, we decided to cut through one of the dining halls instead. Moonlit snow shone through the tall, arched windows, and the tablecloths glowed with an eerie, pale blue light. That's when Shay started saying he felt uneasy and wanted to go back through the tunnels. We all laughed, good old Shay. The three of us, Gary, Lynn, and I, kept going, since the exterior doors were barely 10 meters away, hoping to give Shay a little confidence for the last few steps. Except maybe for Lynn, who crouched under a table and started gently tugging the tablecloth, making the settings rattle and clink together. Jesus crap, stop that, Lynn. I'm not putting up with your mockery right now. Let's go the other way, Shay snapped. Gary pushed open the doors. Outside was breathtaking, moonlit, blue, cool, starry, and perfectly still, except for the wolf. A wolf sat at the bottom of the stone steps, and beyond the path, countless pairs of eyes glimmered beneath the trees, all fixed on us. Gary slammed the doors shut. We laughed for a solid 10 minutes. Gary stayed pressed against the doors, howling with laughter. The rush of adrenaline and relief was unreal. We finally had proof that Shay wasn't full of nonsense after all. He had foreseen a wolf pack. We took the other route. To further cement Shay's reputation as a paranormal gravity, well, it was not even 2 days later that a wolf trotted out of the woods and sat down in the middle of the road, right outside his apartment as we were walking out. Shay just grinned and said, "Well, that settles it. This is our spirit guide. Show us the way to the beer, Wolfie." Shay also inspired a small meme among our friends. The idea that all magic is created through hard drugs. You get really high and start seeing things. And if you get high enough, like Shay, those strange events start to manifest. It's not that you sense what's about to happen or see something unusual. Your substances simply shift everyone's shared consciousness, and that thing becomes real. Watch a fantasy movie with this in mind, say The Lord of the Rings, and you start to see the wizards, the elves, and even Shay in a very different light. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.